Much.
Go right ahead.
As I mentioned, we've had some technical difficulties, and I apologize. We've had a number of things happen, and there's been some Herculean activities taken here by members of the staff, Juan Ugarde and Craig Ellefson, Rachel Fisher, and others who have made this possible, and I thank them greatly. Our internet has been down, so we're upstairs here in the courtyard of the Nixon Library making this presentation. And so one of the interesting facets is I'm just back from jury duty. We didn't know if I'd be available. So here we are, everything seemed to work out. So I've written up all these great notes, and I promise I'll actually look at them throughout this presentation. But I want to make sure that folks understand where we start off with the all-volunteer armed forces and its importance, not only to the 1970s when this really becomes prominent, but to the armed forces today, how it came about. If you're under the impression that the military pushed for an all-volunteer army, you'd be incorrect. It was pushed by economists, believe it or not, Dr. Friedman being one of them. And it was pushed for a number of reasons by economists. There were reasons for wanting an all-volunteer armed forces, but we get into the draft situation after World War II as a result of a number of factors. In 1941, when the United States gets actively involved in World War I, there was no concept that the United States would have a huge standing army at the end of the war. That was not part of anyone's thinking in 1941, and really was not the ideal in 1945. It just turned out that with US becoming one of the major powers in the world, that there were a number of alliances, and there were a number of activities that the United States militarily had to stay involved with, and we see in the 1950s with Korea being an example. So the United States has to now develop this much larger standing army. So how do they do that? They use conscription. But what if I told you that as a result of this conscription, for example, what if I told you that from the 1950s through the end of the Vietnam War, 1973, that the average American soldier, the one that we look on as the protector of the nation's freedoms, what if I told you that they made less than minimum wage? What if I told you that those soldiers made less than minimum wage? Who would want that job? I'm here to tell you that very few people would want that job, and that was one of the issues. In 1966, a group of economists led by the aforementioned Milton Friedman met at the University of Chicago to discuss an all-volunteer armed forces for the United States. One of the takes that Dr. Friedman took, and he proclaimed it loudly, was that a draft was inconsistent with a free society. Now, Martin Anderson, who was an acolyte of Milton Friedman's, who worked closely with President Nixon prior to him becoming president in mid-1960s. He was an advisor on many domestic issues, and he was also a proponent of an all-volunteer armed forces. He would also push that in order to have an all-volunteer armed forces, you would need to increase the pay. That would be one of his big issues. Now, with Congress and the military, they were worried about how much that would cost and the implications on the budgetary side. But Senator Robert Taft, a well-known conservative senator from Ohio, explained before the Senate prior to World War II that the principle of a compulsory draft is basically wrong. If we must use compulsion to get an army, why not use compulsion to get men for other essential tasks? We have time to get the kind of voluntary experts a mechanized army really needs. We have time to do the job without upsetting and perhaps wrecking hundreds of lives. We can do it without overestimating the emergency, and sinking all the present principles we love in the slough of total defense. Free men, free enterprise, free speech are the cornerstones of the American Republic. So you have two differing opinions. The draft is inconsistent with the democracy, with the United States, with freedom. But on the other side, the military has a need. How do we fulfill that need? Now, throughout the history of the United States, it's full of examples pertaining to the usage of the draft to fulfill the needs of the military. George Washington, during the Revolutionary War, viewed the draft as disagreeable, but a necessary alternative to an all-volunteer armed forces. By 1781, the majority of American servicemen at Yorktown were militiamen who had been brought into the Army through a conscription through the states. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, the United States maintained a small professional army to provide a corps on which an undrafted militia and volunteers could build, in an emergency, an army. Now, this would be a core principle for the United States until after World War II. The United States had always had a small basic corps for an army, navy, etc. We'd never had a large standing army. Even if you look at the Civil War, there was a quick lessening of the number of troops, despite the fact that there were still Indian wars going on and there was still Reconstruction. But they always went back to a small basic corps. So the beginning of the Civil War, however, really led to America's first federal and national draft. Ironically enough, in 1862, it would be the Confederacy that passed the first national conscription law, followed by the federal government in 1863. A side note to the federal government's desire for a draft in 1863 is that soon after the Battle of Gettysburg, there were soldiers that had fought for the Union at Gettysburg who actually had to be sent to help quell draft riots in New York City. So we can say that not only in the 1960s, but in the 1860s, the idea of a draft was still not a popular one. Again, during World War II and World War I, the United States combined volunteers with the draft to form the nucleus of their armed forces. With most Americans pressing the Truman administration to halt the draft following World War II, it ceased in March of 1947, only to be temporarily reinstated in 1948 and continued on a limited basis through the Korean War until the beginning of U.S. involvement in Vietnam in 1965. At no point was the draft popular, at no point. Throughout the remainder of the Vietnam War, draft calls would increase, and its unpopularity would increase with the demand for more soldiers. The question then becomes in the 1960s, who is eligible for the draft? Should there be deferments? And do draftees reflect American society as a whole? Or, as a result of these deferments, are only certain portions of the public of the United States, maybe those less fortunate, those less well off, are they then, and minorities, are they becoming the draftees? And are they willing draftees? As the war in Vietnam increased these draft calls, Americans truly turned against the draft, particularly on college campuses, by the students who were most directly affected. Did the fact that college students were out burning their draft cards, protesting against the draft in large gatherings on and off college campuses, provide the reasoning behind Milton Friedman's antipathy toward the draft? No. The Chicago Economist saw the all-volunteered armed forces providing 5 key advantages. One, the first was moral. Elimination of the draft ends up to 2 years what he called involuntary servitude to the state. And it supports the rights of the individual. Second was national security. An all-volunteer armed forces strengthens U.S. military by providing better educated and better motivated and skilled teams of professionals. These are very key in providing a strong all-volunteer armed forces. Now, the third component was economic. Pay and allowance increases will lead to greater retention and easier recruitment. Fewer replacements will be needed, but recruiting will be easier because the pay is substantially better. Fourth is political. Increased military protection with greater individualism and greater individual freedom is always a winner domestically. 1.7 million career military will enjoy greater pay and greater benefits. And so, in terms of social aspects, no individual groups will be disproportionately drafted, and you can actually obtain a well-paid career in the military, and it'll be more attractive to more people. So how do these changes occur? How do we get to this point where it can actually take place? Beginning in '66, with Martin Anderson on the team with President Nixon, these changes begin as it becomes a part of President Nixon's campaign for the presidency. In 1968, during the campaign, he was reacting not only to the ideas of Martin Anderson within his campaign staff, but also he was affected by these college protests. It undoubtedly had an impact. But in a radio address from New York in October of 1968, Nixon stated that a volunteered armed forces would be the fairest, most efficient, and I think the emphasis should be made on most efficient and effective and economical means of meeting military manpower requirements. The selective service system would be maintained, but only on a standby basis. Now, how does this reflect what we have today? This is exactly what we have. We have the selective service on a standby basis in case of emergency, but not as part of our everyday activity. It's not something that the draft has not been reinstituted. So following his election in November of 1968, President Nixon established a commission on an all-volunteer armed forces known as the Gates Commission. In March of 1968, or excuse me, 69, the Gates Commission released its findings in February of, was established in 69, but the commission released its findings in February of 1970. It recommended an end to the draft. Both houses of Congress and the president agreed with this assessment. And in 1971, still in the midst of the Vietnam War, they pass a bill and Nixon signs the bill, which effectively ends the draft in 1973 and commits to an all volunteer armed forces at that point. The reason they're doing this is because it's the esprit de corps in the Army has fallen apart, partially because of the war in Vietnam, but they also need to improve the soldiers that they can get through a voluntary basis. If they improve the environment, if they improve the pay, you will find people who are more motivated to join the military. People will more likely stay. Retention will be higher. You will have higher scoring individuals on the standard IQ test. You'll have a higher percentage of recruits with high school diplomas. You will get a higher number of recruits who are college graduates. You will have increased number of career professionals, increased proficiency, and it will be more broadly representative of the U.S. Population. In other words, you'll have a new all-volunteer armed forces that is better paid, with better incentives, and more efficient. In the end, Those who wanted an end to the draft supported the words of Senator Robert Taft when he declared, "The compulsory draft is far more typical of a totalitarian nation than of democratic nations. The theory behind it leads directly to totalitarianism. It is absolutely opposed to the principles of individual liberty, which have always been considered a part of American democracy." And if we look back at the last 40 plus years of an all volunteer army, we can look back and state that today, right now, we have a better trained, more efficient, and better armed forces than we ever had in our nation's history. And on that, I will end. If there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Juan, questions? What do I do for questions? I'm done with the presentation. All right. There we go.
What this happened?
I am not the technological person here, so thank God Juan is here.
We can have teachers put their questions in the chat. It's probably the easiest.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And then we can relay them to you if you can't see them.
I think I can see him now. Come on by. Okay, one new message. What about the overrepresentation of by POC in armed forces? I'm not exactly sure what that means. So I'm not really sure if you could, Brian.
Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Okay. The problem with the draft was you were getting more people of color. With the all volunteer army, it's more representative of the nation as a whole. And the fact is there's better pay, better opportunities, better jobs. If we refer back to our previous speaker, that minorities, particularly in Watts, were looking for a hand up, not a handout. This is a good job. Martin Luther King is asking for good jobs. These are now the good jobs that are available. You're getting representative pay now to be in the armed forces as opposed. So, did they actually see an effect on the economy as a result of the draft being canceled? No, what happened is that military expenditures went up because the pay went up, and that they knew that there was going to be essentially a 7 to 10 year period in which the expenditures go up to make the pay equitable with the private sector. So that was an impact, but you'd also see by the time we get to the Reagan administration, you have a more professional military than you did in the late 60s, early 70s. You don't have the draftees, and you don't have the same problems with the esprit de corps. How did the draft lottery instituted shortly after Nixon take office factor into the overall change to an all volunteer military? It was I would say it was a way station on the way. It was a place to try to make the draft more equitable, knowing that that wasn't the stopping point, but that we were moving on to the final, which would be an all volunteer armed forces. So it didn't change. It was just a brief resting point. So are there any other questions, or did I miss any? Let me go. Isn't there still a class and regional issue? The 50% of the Army recruits came from Florida and Texas. Also a 1980 special, Who Will Fight for America, stated that only 33 college graduates. Well, in 1980, you're still dealing with the early portions of the changeover to an all volunteer armed forces. the view of the military in 1980 was still incredibly poor in this post-Vietnam era. It's no longer seen as a negative to be a member of the military. Can't tell you how many times you hear that term, somebody saying to a veteran or somebody who was in the military, thank you for the service. I guarantee you that did not happen in 1973, 74, 1980, and on and on. That is a more recent. Now, did the relatively young age of the Vietnam vets lead to more public dissatisfaction? Absolutely. Absolutely. The draft was focused on college students, and they were not supportive of the war. So yes, that was going to have a negative impact. So yeah, it could not have a negative impact. And then there's another question, isn't there still a class and regional issue? It's not as prevalent as it was with the draft. You're not taking a whole class of people and taking them out of the pool like you did with college students. As long as you have a better pay, better opportunities, we are getting a better, smarter, more efficient, more effective armed forces now than we've ever had in the history of the United States. I think it's more reflective of who we are as a nation. Now, will it ever be 100% accurate in terms of its reflection of the nation? No, but we can do a better job than the draft ever did. Now, it also said that 50% of the Army recruits came from Florida and Texas. I'm not sure that that is still the case. I'm absolutely pretty certain that is not the case. I know there's a great deal of representation in the state of California, as there are in other states as well. Like I said, it provides the opportunity for people to get a good job. Any other questions?
Not so much a question, but a comment. I had a 3-time tour veteran of Vietnam, and he was quite clear about his treatment when he came back, and that this draft for me was, I was 18 and a senior in high school. I got a greetings card saying if I didn't get over there pretty quick, they had other places for me to go. So I was there the next day at the courtroom registry.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in the, there's this great photo of one of the preparations for the anti-draft protest. And there's a gentleman from the New Left, Rennie Davis. And he had a poster in the background. It said, take a wonderful senior trip to lovely Vietnam. And they were making fun of these. It's the situation where you graduate from high school, but if you're not going directly into college, guess what? You're now eligible for the draft, and you could find yourself in Vietnam. So yeah, that is a story that's been told by many.
Yeah, that's what John would tell my class, that he went to West Virginia University and partied instead of studying, and he got a greetings letter and ended up being a career officer.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know if anybody, and I hate to bring this movie into it, but if you've ever seen the movie Animal House, what does Dean Wormer say when he kicks them all out? He goes, oh, by the way, I've notified all of your draft boards. So when you get thrown, if you're not making the grade in college, that's what they would do. The university would then let the draft boards know that you are now eligible to be drafted. There's another question that came in. Could people buy their way out of the draft like they did during the Civil War? No, you could not. But there were situations of people who were wealthier, who had sympathetic doctors who could write them draft deferments. A good friend of mine was offered one of those draft deferments, and he hemmed and hawed over it over a couple of days and went back to his doctor and told him no, he couldn't accept the deferment. His dad fought in World War II, and he wouldn't be able to face his dad if he didn't do likewise. And he had just graduated with a master's degree, and he was in between, hadn't decided whether to go on for his PhD, and snapped him up real quick. And he ended up serving in Vietnam. So no, you could not buy your way out. Your best bet was to find a doctor who could find a deferment for you for a physical issue. For example, one example is the reason President Trump didn't serve in Vietnam is because he had a deferment for bone spurs. So if you've ever heard that derogative name, if in leftist or in some circles, they call him Captain Bone Spurs. So yeah, there's that era. You could get deferments for medical issues, but you could also get deferments like Bill Clinton got a deferment for going to Oxford University and being a Rhodes Scholar. It was weighed heavily in favor of middle class, upper middle class Americans. And one could say by that, Caucasians in the 1960s and early 1970s. The draft provided opportunities for the wealthier individuals to avoid service.
Jump in again. John brought in the stat that far as the story that blacks served more in Vietnam. He says statistically, the same percentage of the blacks in American society were also in Vietnam with him fighting.
Yeah. Somebody also brought in this great line from CC&R, Creedence Clearwater Revival, one of my favorite songs, Fortunate Son. I ain't no millionaire's son. There was a point to what CCR was trying to say in that song, Fortunate Son. Didn't have a silver spoon, they were making a very valid point about the draft. It is about the circumstances surrounding the draft. So that was a very great point there. I'm glad you brought it up. But the key point here, if you leave with nothing else, is that the draft was extremely unfair and unbalanced. That's the point I'd like to get across. Any other questions? All right, well, nobody else wants to talk about CCR, I guess. I should have done my presentation on that.
We appreciate the time, Dr. Cummings, and we really appreciate, particularly today, I know the Nixon Library's had a lot of trouble with internet and so on, so we appreciate your team stringing the wires together and getting out the tinfoil and making the internet work today. I really appreciate it. I know you guys have been struggling, and so really appreciate everything you've done to make this live connection work today. I know how difficult that can be. Thank you for having us, and I'd like to give a big shout out to Juan Ugardi, who made this happen. He is the genius behind this. So I'd like to say it was me, but it's not. Well, we appreciate your expertise, and we do appreciate Juan and those behind the scenes that kept that live connection. You sounded great, so I know that you guys have been struggling today, so I really appreciate it. And I know the teachers do too. So thank you, Dr. Cummings, very much.